I'm gonna show you the best Sony lenses for video for Sony APS-C cameras. How's it going? My name is Jussi and this channel is all about filmmaking, tips and tutorials and camera gear. So on this video I'm gonna help you to make an educated decision on which lens or lenses are the best ones for your needs for your Sony APS-C camera. Also, if you're interested in buying one of these lenses, I've got them all linked in the description below. So the first lens that I want to talk about is the Sony A6100 OSS f4 lens. And this comes around $650. Now, because the Sony APS-C cameras have a 1.5 times crop, that makes this lens an equivalent to 27 to 157 millimeters on a full frame like the Sony A7 III. And because this lens has so many different focal lengths inside one lens, that makes this lens such a versatile lens, and it's a great run and gun lens for those kind of situations where you might not want to be changing lenses for each and every different shot, or you might not even have time to do it because you might have to, for example, rebalance your gimbal. And speaking of gimbals, because this lens has an internal zoom, that means that when you zoom and change the focal length, it happens completely internally inside the lens. That makes this ideal for gimbal use because you don't have to rebalance your gimbal every single time you have changed the focal length. This lens has also something that Sony calls OSS, which stands for Optical Steady Shot, which basically means that it has stabilization built in. And that's really helpful when you're shooting handheld, because you get rid of those micro jitters and it's a lot easier to get very steady and smooth shots. But some of the cons that I've found in this lens are that because it has an aperture of f4, it means that it doesn't bring much light to the sensor, which means that it's not very ideal for low light filming. And because of that aperture of f4, it's also not gonna give you that very nice cinematic looking background blur, that nice bokeh. And it's also not very good for vlogging because at its widest focal length, it's only 18 millimeters, which is gonna be quite tight. So for vlogging, I wouldn't definitely recommend this lens. But I do have to summarize it by saying that if you're in a situation that you can only buy one lens, then this is the go-to lens. Okay, so the next lens is one of my favorites. It's the Sony 10 to 18 millimeter f4 OSS wide-angle zoom lens. This comes around $900 and it's equivalent to 15 to 27 millimeters on a full-frame camera. And because this lens is so wide at 10 millimeters, it's my favorite vlogging lens, and it's also fantastic for filming cinematic sequences handheld because it has stabilization built in. And the fact that it's so wide makes it also hide those micro jitters that you easily get when you film handheld, and it's just an overall very good wide-angle lens. But I must say that the cons of this lens are, for example, that at its widest at 10 millimeters, there's a little bit of distortion, but the good thing is that you can always use it at, let's say, 11 millimeters or 12 millimeters, and that will help a little bit by getting a little bit of rid of that distortion that you get with the 10 millimeter focal length. And the other thing is that because it's an f4 lens and doesn't bring much light to the sensor, it's not very good in low light situations. Okay, the next lens is from my favorite lens manufacturer. It's the Sigma 30mm f1.4 lens. It comes around $350 and it's equivalent to 45 millimeters on a full frame camera. Now, many people say that a 50mm focal length is an ideal focal length for close-ups and tight shots, and because this is a 45mm full frame equivalent, that makes it very close to the 50mm focal length. And I personally use this for so many of my talking head YouTube videos, and also for getting those very detailed close-up shots. And what I like about these Sigma lenses are that they're all extremely sharp and they probably got the best bang for your buck. I mean, they've got great colors and really high quality glass and just in general great lenses. One of the most important things of this lens for me is the fact that the aperture is f1.4, which means that it lets a lot of light into the sensor, which makes it great in low light situations. And also because of that wide open aperture, you get that really sweet bokeh, that nice background blur, which for me is a very important thing also. I've also found that the focal length, the 45mm full frame equivalent, is very ideal for my use because I've owned a 50mm on a crop sensor camera, which makes it like something around 75mm on a full frame. I found that that focal length is a little bit too tight, but this is kind of like it's a good all-around lens. And especially when I'm filming a lot of my videos at home and our apartment isn't very big, so this is kind of ideal for my use. And honestly, with this lens, probably the only con that I can think of is the fact that the focus ring is focused by wire, which means that the focus ring spins infinitely, and this makes it very hard to do focus pulls. But then again, I don't really do any focus pulls that often, so it's not a deal breaker for me at least. And oh boy, now we finally get to my favorite lens by far. It's the Sigma 60mm f1.4 lens. It comes around $400 and it's equivalent to 24mm on a full frame camera. And to be honest, one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to get this lens is the fact that Peter Lindgren uses his 24mm G Master f1.4 lens with his Sony A7 III in almost all of his cinematic sequences. And I really like the look that he has. And with the crop factor, since this is a full frame equivalent of 24mm, you get pretty close to that similar look. And you kind of get that full frame look, which I really like. And the good thing about this lens is that because it's a fairly wide lens, it's wide enough so you can get close to the action, but it's not too wide and it doesn't distort the image, which makes it look more cinematic and it's more pleasing to the eye in my opinion. And just like with the 30mm Sigma lens, the only con that I can think of with the 60mm Sigma lens is the fact that the focus ring is focused by wire. But like I said before, it's not a big deal for me, so it's definitely not a deal breaker. The next lens that I need to talk to you about is something that I unfortunately don't have in my possession currently because I don't own it yet. But I've rented it and used it several times and it's amazing. It's the Sony SEL 50mm f1.8 and it comes around $300 and it's equivalent to 75mm on a full frame camera. Many people say that the ideal focal length for filming people and close-up shots and portraits is 85mm on a full frame. Now, because this lens has a 75mm full frame equivalent, which is very close to the 85, and an aperture of f1.8, this makes this lens an ideal lens for those kind of situations. I personally use this lens whenever I want to isolate the subject from the background or the surroundings and get this really nice shallow depth of field and that background blur because of that 1.8 aperture. The lens is also very sharp, it's great in low light, and because it has this stabilization built in, it's also very good for filming handheld. You get surprisingly stable footage by filming handheld with the lens. But one thing that I almost forgot to say is the fact that with all of the lenses that I've talked about in this video, the autofocus is surprisingly good with the Sony A6500. So if you need to film in a gimbal and do some kind of a follow shot, it's very useful to use autofocus that actually works, even though I personally mostly use manual focus. Also, if you want to learn more, I recommend that you watch this playlist or video over here, because I think you're really gonna like it. Okay, thanks for watching and see you again on Monday. Take care.